He was just a single, broke janitor in row 17, until the plane crashed and the pilot called his name. What happened next would change everything. This is a story of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and turn on notifications. Stories like this remind us that heroes come from the unlikeliest places. The Invisible Man. Ethan Cole had spent his life being overlooked. At 34, he was the kind of man who blended into the background, a ghost in his own story. His hands were rough from years of pushing mops across the scuffed floors of O'Hare Airport. His shoulders permanently slumped from the weight of missed opportunities. Tonight, he sat in row 17 of Oceanic Airways Flight 422, squeezed into a window seat, his duffel bag stuffed beneath the seat in front of him. He hadn't paid for the ticket. Not exactly. It was a standby voucher, one of the few perks of being an airport janitor, and he was using it for the first time in years. His sister's wedding. The thought made his stomach tighten. Claire had sent the invitation out of obligation, not because they were close. They hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since the divorce, not since he'd stopped returning her calls. But something in him had whispered, go, show up for once. So here he was, in a wrinkled button-down and his least stained pair of jeans, trying not to think about how little he had to offer. The plane hummed around him, a steady mechanical lullaby. Outside the window, storm clouds gathered, their dark edges lit by intermittent flashes of distant lightning. The woman beside him, Lena, she'd said her name was when she'd squeezed past him to her seat, flipped through a magazine, her knee bouncing slightly. She was younger than him, maybe late 20s, with sharp, observant eyes. He could tell she was the kind of person who noticed things. You work at O'Hare? She asked suddenly, nodding toward the employee badge still clipped to his belt. Ethan glanced down, as if he'd forgotten it was there. Yeah, he muttered. Maintenance. She smiled, undeterred by his lack of engagement. I'm a nurse, just coming back from a conference. When he didn't respond, she added, You headed home, or? Wedding, he said, the word tasting bitter. Lena opened her mouth to reply, but the plane lurched violently, cutting her off. Overhead, the fastened seatbelt sign flickered on with a ding. A murmur of unease rippled through the cabin. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Ethan gripped the armrests as the plane shuddered again. Across the aisle, a child whimpered. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Lena let out a slow breath. Guess we're in for a bumpy ride. Ethan didn't answer. His throat felt tight. He hated flying, hated the lack of control, hated the way it reminded him of all the things he couldn't fix. Then, without warning, the plane dropped. It was like hitting a void in the sky. 1 second they were level. The next his stomach was in his throat as they plunged downward. Screams erupted. A drink cart slammed into the bulkhead, cans and bottles scattering. Oxygen masks tumbled from the ceiling, swinging wildly. Brace! Brace! A flight attendant shouted. Ethan fumbled for his mask, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. Next to him, Lena was already securing hers, her movements quick and precise. The plane tilted sharply to the left, and Ethan's shoulder slammed into the window. Outside, the storm raged, lightning illuminating the chaos inside the cabin. Then silence, not the absence of noise, but the absence of engines. The hum was gone. The plane was gliding, a wounded bird in freefall. The cockpit door burst open. A man in a pilot's uniform staggered out, one hand clutching his bleeding forehead. His eyes scanned the rows frantically before locking on to Ethan. Is there an Ethan Cole on this flight? He shouted, voice raw with urgency. Ethan's blood went cold. The pilot's gaze zeroed in on him. You're Cole? We need you up front. Now. For a heartbeat, Ethan didn't move. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then Lena turned to him, her eyes wide. You're a medic? The words hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Ethan hadn't been a medic in years. Not since the Army. Not since the day he'd failed to save someone. But the pilot was still staring at him, waiting. and the plane was still falling. The call. Ethan's body moved before his mind could catch up the moment the pilot shouted his name. Something primal kicked in, an old instinct buried beneath years of self-doubt. He unbuckled his seatbelt with shaking hands and stood, the plane's violent sway nearly knocking him into the aisle. Lena grabbed his wrist. "You're a medic?" she asked again, louder this time. There was no judgment in her voice, only urgency. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth was, he had been a medic once, back in another life, back when he still believed he could make a difference. But that was before the desert, before the blood on his hands that no amount of scrubbing could wash away. The pilot, Captain Daniel Shaw, according to the name stitched on his uniform, reached for him as Ethan stumbled forward. "We've got multiple injuries up here," Shaw said, his voice low and rough. "Our flight medic hit his head when we lost pressure. He's out cold, and my co-pilot's in bad shape." Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. The cabin was chaos. Passengers sobbing, a child screaming for her mother, the metallic scent of fear thick in recycled air. He forced himself to focus. "Where's your kit?" Shaw jerked his head toward the cockpit, behind the seats. "Hurry!" Ethan followed, his legs unsteady beneath him. As he passed row 5, a man in a business suit grabbed his arm. "What the hell's happening? Are we going down?" Ethan shook him off. "Sit tight. Put your mask on." The cockpit was worse than he'd imagined. The co-pilot, a woman in her 40s, was slumped in her seat, her forehead split open, blood dripping down her temple. The flight medic, a younger guy in a Navy uniform, lay crumpled near the doorway, his breathing shallow. Shaw shoved the first aid kit into Ethan's hands. "I've got to get back to the controls. Can you handle this?" Ethan's fingers tightened around the kit. He hadn't so much as touched a bandage in 5 years. But the co-pilot's eyelids fluttered, her lips moving soundlessly, and suddenly he was back in the Army, back in that dusty field hospital where he'd last failed someone. No, not again. He dropped to his knees beside the medic, checking his pulse. Steady but weak. Concussion, probably. He tore open the kit, grabbing gauze and tape. "Hey, stay with me," he muttered, pressing the gauze to the co-pilot's wound. She winced but didn't pull away. Behind him, Shaw cursed. "We've lost hydraulics. We're going to have to ditch." Ethan's stomach dropped. Ditch. That meant water. Or mountains. Either way, it meant impact. The co-pilot grabbed his sleeve, her fingers trembling. "Passengers," she gasped. "Brace positions, tell them." Ethan nodded. He turned to Shaw. "I need to get back there. They need to know what's coming." Shaw's jaw clenched, but he gave a sharp nod. 2 minutes. Then I need you back here." Ethan stumbled into the cabin again, his voice raw as he shouted over the din, "Listen up. We're making an emergency landing. Get into brace positions. Heads down, hands behind your necks. Now!" Some passengers obeyed immediately, folding forward. Others froze, paralyzed by fear. Lena stood, helping an elderly couple near her assume the position. A man in row 10, Greg, Ethan would later learn, stood up, his face flushed with panic. "We're gonna die. We're all gonna die." Ethan grabbed him by the shoulders. "Sit. Down." The command in his voice surprised even him. Greg sank back into his seat, trembling. Ethan turned to Lena. "You got medical training?" She nodded. "AR nurse." "Then you're with me. We've got wounded up front." Before she could respond, the plane jolted violently. The overhead bins burst open, bags and jackets raining down. A woman screamed as the oxygen masks swung like pendulums. Shaw's voice crackled over the intercom, eerily calm. "Brace for impact. This is not a drill. Heads down, stay down." Ethan locked eyes with Lena. There was no time to get back to the cockpit. He dropped into the nearest empty seat, gripping the armrests. "Get down!" he roared at the cabin. The last thing he saw before the world exploded into noise was Lena bending over a little girl, shielding her with her body. Then impact, a deafening crunch of metal, the shriek of tearing aluminum. The plane bucked like a wild animal, throwing Ethan forward against the seatbelt. Something heavy slammed into his shoulder. A carry-on, maybe. Pain exploded down his arm. For one terrifying second, everything was weightless. Then the world went black. The descent, the first thing Ethan became aware of was a cold. It seeped through his clothes, sharp and biting, dragging him back to consciousness. His head pounded, a dull, insistent throbbing behind his temples. For a moment, he thought he was back in Chicago, waking up on the floor of his tiny apartment after another night of drinking too much to quiet the memories. But then the smell hit him, burning metal, fuel, the coppery tang of blood, and it all came rushing back. The plane, the crash. Ethan forced his eyes open. The cabin was a war zone. Seats had been ripped from their moorings, twisted into grotesque shapes. Luggage and debris littered the aisle. Through a jagged tear in the fuselage, freezing wind howled, carrying with it flakes of snow. Daylight streamed in weakly, illuminating the dust and smoke swirling in the air. Groans and whimpers rose from the survivors. Someone was sobbing, a high, broken sound. "Lena?" Ethan croaked. His throat felt raw, like he'd swallowed glass. He fumbled with his seatbelt, his fingers numb and clumsy. When it finally released, he nearly fell forward into the seat in front of him. His shoulders screamed in protest, the pain from whatever had hit him during impact now a sharp, stabbing sensation with every movement. A hand grabbed his arm. Ethan jerked around to see Lena, her face streaked with soot and blood, one sleeve of her shirt torn. "You're alive," she breathed. There was a cut above her eyebrow, the blood already drying in a dark line down her temple. The others. Ethan started, but she was already nodding. "The cockpit," she said grimly. "We need to get to them." They picked their way through the wreckage, stepping over shattered plastic and twisted metal. A man, Greg, the panicked one from before, was slumped in his seat, unconscious but breathing. A few rows ahead, the elderly couple Lena had helped earlier clutched each other, their faces pale with shock but otherwise unharmed. Then they reached the front of the plane. The cockpit door had been torn clean off its hinges. Captain Shaw was pinned beneath a collapsed section of the ceiling, his legs trapped. His face was ashen, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. The co-pilot, Ethan never did learn her name, lay motionless beside him, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling shallowly. The flight medic was stirring nearby, groaning as he tried to sit up. Shaw's gaze locked onto Ethan. "Cole," he rasped, "you're not dead. Good." Ethan dropped to his knees beside him, assessing the damage. The metal pressing down on Shaw's legs was bad, really bad. One wrong move, and they could crush him completely. "We need to get this off you," he said. Lena was already checking the co-pilot's pulse. "She's in shock," she said quietly. "Possible internal injuries. We need to keep her warm." Ethan looked around for something, anything, to lever the debris off Shaw. His eyes landed on a piece of broken seat frame nearby. "Help me with this," he said to Lena. Together, they wedged the metal bar under the collapsed ceiling and pushed. Ethan's shoulder burned, the pain so intense his vision blurred at the edges. But slowly, inch by agonizing inch, the debris lifted. Shaw gritted his teeth, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as he dragged himself free. His legs were a mess. One was clearly broken, the bone pressing unnaturally against the fabric of his pants. The other was a bloody ruin of torn flesh. Ethan swallowed hard, pushing down the bile rising in his throat. He'd seen worse in the Army. That didn't make it any easier. "We need splints," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "And bandages. Anything we can use to stop the bleeding." Lena nodded and turned to ransack the nearby luggage for anything useful. Shaw grabbed Ethan's wrist. "The radio," he gasped. "Try the radio." Ethan glanced at the cockpit controls. Most were smashed beyond recognition, but the radio might still be intact. He hauled himself into the pilot's seat, wincing as his shoulder protested. The radio crackled weakly when he flipped the switch. "Mayday, mayday," he said, repeating the word Shaw had used earlier. "This is Oceanic 422. We've gone down in the mountains. Does anyone copy?" Static. Ethan tried again, his voice growing hoarse. "Mayday, mayday. Is anyone out there?" More static. Then, faint but unmistakable, a voice. Igno weak, Catian? Repeat your. Ethan's heart leaped. We're down in the mountains. I don't know our exact location. Multiple injuries, need immediate. The radio cut out with a burst of static. Ethan frantically adjusted the dials, but the voice was gone. Did they hear us? Shaw asked. I don't know, Ethan admitted. A noise from outside the plane made them both freeze. A low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving through the underbrush. Lena's eyes widened. Was that? Another growl, closer this time. Ethan's blood ran cold. Wolves. And they were hungry. The wolves at dawn. The growl came again, closer this time. A deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through the broken fuselage. Ethan's muscles locked. He'd heard that sound before, years ago during survival training in Wyoming. A pack on the hunt. Lena's hand found his arm, her fingers digging in. We need to barricade the opening, she whispered. Ethan nodded, scanning the wreckage. The tear in the plane side was too large to cover completely, but maybe they could build a barrier. He moved toward a collapsed overhead bin, his boots crunching on broken glass. The sound seemed deafening in the tense silence. Help me with this, he muttered to Lena. Together, they dragged the twisted metal frame toward the gap. Every scrape and clang made Ethan wince, his eyes darting to the tree line beyond. Then he saw them. Eyes, glowing yellow in the fading light, low to the ground. No, 6 pairs, watching from the shadows of pines. The alpha stepped forward first, a massive gray beast with mangled ear, its muzzle stained dark. It sniffed the air, then let out a sharp bark. The pack answered. Get back! Ethan shoved Lena behind him as the wolves crept closer, their movements fluid and deliberate. Inside the cabin, a child began to cry. Greg, now conscious but still pale, staggered to his feet. Oh, God, oh, God. He grabbed a piece of broken plastic, brandishing it like a weapon. Get out of here, he screamed, voice cracking. The alpha wolf bared its teeth. Ethan's mind raced. They were injured, exhausted, and outnumbered. A direct fight would be suicide. But wolves were cautious. They wouldn't attack unless they sensed weakness. Lena, he said quietly, the flare gun. Did you find it? She shook her head. Not yet, but her eyes lit up. The emergency kit near the cockpit. There might be. A snarl cut her off. The alpha had crept within 10 feet of the opening, its hackles raised. Behind it, the others fanned out, surrounding the wreck. Ethan slowly reached for a metal pole lying near his feet. When I say go, he breathed, run for the kit. The wolf lunged. Ethan swung. The pole connected with the alpha's shoulder, sending it yelping back. The pack erupted in furious snarls. Now! Lena darted toward the cockpit as Ethan swung again, keeping the wolves at bay. Greg joined him, swinging wildly with his makeshift weapon. Light something on fire. Ethan shouted. They hate fire. From the corner of his eye, he saw the elderly man fumbling with a lighter and a magazine. His hands shook so badly the flame died twice. Then whoosh! A flare shot past Ethan's face, so close he felt its heat. It struck the alpha's paw, sending the beast scrambling back with a howl. Lena stood in the aisle, the flare gun smoking in her hands. Found it, she panted. The wolves retreated, but only just. They circled at a distance now, eyes still gleaming with hunger. Ethan grabbed a lighter from the old man and lit a strip of torn fabric. He tossed it toward the opening. The flames caught on spilled fuel, creating a wavering line of fire between them and the pack. For now, they were safe. Shaw groaned from his makeshift bed near the cockpit. Cole, he rasped. The radio, did they? Ethan wiped sweat from his brow. Someone answered, but I don't know if they heard our location. Lena sank down beside him, her hands trembling. So what now? Ethan looked at the survivors, the crying child, the injured pilot, the terrified passengers. Then he stared out at the darkening woods, where the wolves still prowled. Now, he said quietly, we wait for dawn. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, The alpha wolf howled, a long, mournful sound that raised a hair on Ethan's neck. The night was going to be very, very long. The signal, the fire burned low, its orange glow barely holding back the darkness. Ethan sat with his back against the twisted seat frame, his eyes gritty from exhaustion. Every howl from the wolves outside sent a fresh wave of tension through the survivors. The night stretched on, endless and cold. Lena handed him a torn piece of cloth wrapped around a handful of snow. "For your shoulder," she said quietly. Ethan pressed it against the throbbing wound, the cold biting through the numbness. He hadn't realized how badly he'd been hurt until the adrenaline faded. The little girl, Mia, her name was Mia, curled against her mother, her wide eyes reflecting the dying firelight. "Are the doggies gone?" she whispered. Ethan forced a smile. "Soon." But the truth was, he didn't know. The flare had bought them time, but the pack was still out there, waiting. And when dawn came, they'd need a plan. Shaw stirred, his face pale with pain. "Cole," he rasped, "the emergency beacon should have activated on impact. If it's working, they'll find us. If..." Ethan glanced at the broken cockpit. The beacon was likely buried under debris, if it hadn't been destroyed completely. Greg, who had been pacing near the barricade, suddenly froze. "Do you hear that?" Silence. Then a distant rhythmic thumping. Ethan's heart leapt. Helicopter. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain. "We need a signal." The sound grew louder, but the trees were too dense, the wreckage too hidden. The helicopter passed overhead, its searchlight sweeping the wrong ridge. "They're going to miss us." Lena shouted. Ethan's mind raced. The flare gun was empty. The fire was too weak. Then his eyes landed on the cracked cockpit window and the co-pilot's broken wristwatch beside Shaw. "Mirror," he breathed. He snatched up the watch, angling its reflective surface toward the faint morning light. With shaking hands, he flashed it toward the sound of the rotors. Nothing. The helicopter's sound began to fade. "Ethan." Lena's voice was tight with desperation. He adjusted his grip, his fingers numb with cold. "Come on. Come on." One last flash. The helicopter's engine roar changed pitch. It was turning. A spotlight swept across the trees, then locked onto the wreckage. "They see us." Mia shrieked. Chaos erupted as the survivors surged to their feet, waving and shouting. The wolves scattered as the helicopter descended, its downdraft sending snow swirling in wild patterns. Ethan sagged against the broken hull, his legs suddenly weak. They'd made it. Epilogue. 3 months later. The news called them the miracle of Flight 422. Ethan sat in a sunlit cafe, his nursing textbook spread across the table. His shoulders still ached in the cold, but the sling was gone. Lena slid into the seat across from him, 2 coffees in hand. "You look terrible," she said, grinning. "Midterms," he grumbled, but he couldn't stop the smile tugging at his lips. She pushed a newspaper toward him. The headline read, "Crash Survivors Reunite for Captain Shaw's Retirement." Shaw had kept his leg, though he'd never fly again. Greg had checked into rehab. Mia had started kindergarten, her backpack covered in airplane stickers. And Ethan? He touched the small pilot's wings pin on his jacket, Shaw's gift. For when you're ready to fly again. Maybe he already was. This story proves that even in our darkest moments, hope can take flight. If Ethan's journey inspired you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder. Heroes don't always wear capes. Subscribe for more real-life stories of courage against the odds.